It began with a storm. Not the kind that churns the skies, but one that brewed inside Eleanor Cavendish's heart. She was a woman of precision, elegance, and undeniable pride. A designer who held the fashion world in her palm while keeping everyone else at arm's length. Her life was built on control, a fortress of luxury and ambition, and she guarded it fiercely. But like all fortresses, there were cracks, ones she refused to see. Her father, Lord William Cavendish, had always been a man of calculation. As one of the most powerful magnates in telecommunications, he thrived on logic and foresight. And when threats came, those unspoken, chilling promises whispered by rivals, he acted without hesitation. Eleanor would be protected, whether she liked it or not. And so, James entered her life. He was not the knight she had imagined, nor the kind of man who would bow to her whims. A former SAS officer with a quiet intensity that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried, James moved with a purpose that Eleanor despised. He didn't flinch under her sharp words or wither under her glare. This was a man who had faced war zones, who had lost comrades, and who carried scars both visible and hidden. Eleanor, with her cutting tongue and piercing beauty, was not a challenge, at least, not in the way she thought. From the very beginning, their worlds clashed. She rejected him outright, treating his presence as an affront to her independence. Every glance, every silence between them was a battlefield. He was unshaken, immovable, as though her fury was nothing more than a passing storm he had weathered before. The first days were a dance of defiance and duty. Eleanor, determined to prove she didn't need him, pushed boundaries she didn't even realize existed. She would leave the house without a word, her high heels clicking defiantly against the marble floors. Yet, James was always there, waiting, watching, a shadow that refused to be shaken. And when she demanded he act as her driver, it wasn't a request, but a declaration of control. She reveled in treating him as nothing more than hired help, her barbed comments cutting through the air as if to remind him of his place. But James remained silent. His responses came in the form of unwavering professionalism, a kind of stoic strength that both infuriated and unnerved her. Harrods became a battleground one crisp afternoon. Eleanor, draped in couture, strolled through the aisles with the deliberate grace of a predator. She thought she could outmaneuver him, slipping into the crowd and vanishing into the sea of opulence. But James found her. He always did. There was no triumph in his gaze, no smug satisfaction at her failure to evade him. Instead, there was something else, an understanding she couldn't place, as though he saw through her games and into the cracks she tried to hide. And that, more than anything, made her blood boil. Meanwhile, Lord Cavendish watched from the shadows of his empire. He knew his daughter's spirit, her fire, and he knew the man he had hired to protect her. It was a gamble, pairing two forces of such opposing nature. But it was one he was willing to make. James, too, understood the stakes. Over drinks with his fellow security personnel, David and Michael, the banter was light but edged with truth. They teased him, suggesting that Eleanor's sharp edges would either wear him down or draw him in. James dismissed their words, insisting he was there to do a job, nothing more. But even he couldn't ignore the undercurrent between them. Then came the morning of his mistake. A rare moment of weakness, a night spent drowning the weight of his responsibilities in a pint too many, left him late to work. When he arrived, Eleanor was waiting, her fury as sharp as a blade. The reprimand was scathing, her voice cutting through him with precision. Yet, beneath her anger, there was something else, a flicker of disappointment she couldn't quite hide. The tension reached its peak with Alexander's arrival. A man who embodied charm and ambition, Alexander was everything Eleanor had been taught to value. His polished demeanor and relentless pursuit were impossible to ignore. But James saw through it, the possessiveness that lingered beneath Alexander's compliments, the quiet threat behind his smile. When Alexander stepped too close, James intervened. It wasn't dramatic or violent, but it was enough. The unspoken warning in his presence was clear, and Alexander left, though not without casting a lingering look that promised he wouldn't be so easily deterred. Eleanor, enraged by what she perceived as interference, fired James on the spot. For James, the dismissal was both a relief and a burden lifted. He returned to his modest apartment, where his world narrowed to his sister Lily. She was the light in his otherwise shadowed life, her laughter a balm for the scars he carried. They spent the day in the park, her joy infectious, her fragility a constant reminder of life's fragility. And unbeknownst to him, Eleanor watched from afar. She had come to observe, to convince herself of her triumph in dismissing him. But what she saw, the tenderness between James and Lily, the way he smiled, free from the weight of her disdain, shifted something inside her. For the first time, Eleanor saw James not as an obstacle or a shadow, but as a man. What she did with that revelation, however, remained to be seen. The passing days wove a fragile tapestry, one stitched with silences, regrets, and secrets waiting to unravel. Eleanor Cavendish carried herself as though James had never existed, yet his absence loomed over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. She continued her public facade, a woman untouched by sentiment or consequence, but beneath the polished surface was a gnawing unease. The arrogance she wore like armor began to crack, and it was in those cracks that the truth began to bloom. For James, life without Eleanor was simpler, quieter, but no less heavy. His world had always been anchored by duty, whether on the battlefield or in protecting those who could not protect themselves. Now, that duty was singularly focused on his sister, Lily. Her health was slipping, each hospital visit a reminder of the clock ticking ever louder. Her joy, though undiminished, was a light he feared might flicker out too soon. But even in darkness, there are unexpected sources of light. Lily began speaking of a fairy godmother, a mysterious figure who visited her in the hospital, leaving behind small tokens of care, a basket of ripe fruits, an envelope with crisp bills tucked discreetly inside, and sometimes, a simple but heartfelt note. At first, James dismissed it as a kind stranger's charity. But the details grew too specific, too deliberate to be coincidence. When Lily mentioned the name Eleanor, it hit him like a thunderclap. He hadn't spoken of her in weeks, yet here she was, invisibly entwined in the life he thought she had abandoned. Slowly, he began piecing it together, the anonymous donations, the hospital staff's hushed mentions of a well-dressed visitor, the faintest hint of her familiar perfume lingering in the air. Eleanor had been there all along, silently reaching into his world, not for recognition but out of something deeper, something unspoken. And yet, even as he learned of her kindness, his pride warred with his gratitude. The Eleanor he had known was sharp-edged, calculating, and guarded. This act of selflessness did not fit the narrative he had built around her. It left him questioning not just her, but himself. As the months passed, Lily's condition worsened. The hospital bills mounted, and James's resources dwindled. His work at a local supermarket was steady but far from sufficient. He tried to shield Lily from his growing desperation, but the weight of it pressed heavily on him. He was a man trained to face danger, to endure hardship, but this was a battle he could not fight with skill or strategy. It was Lily, in one of her lucid moments, who urged him to seek help. She reminded him, in her soft, unyielding way, that even the strongest soldiers needed allies. And though she did not name Eleanor directly, her meaning was clear. Meanwhile, Eleanor's life continued its outward spiral of extravagance and emptiness. The parties, the fashion shows, the endless parade of suitors like Alexander, all of it began to feel like static. She thought often of James, though she would never admit it aloud. His unwavering presence, his quiet strength, his refusal to be cowed by her, they had left an impression she couldn't erase. And then there was Lily, the fragile girl whose light reminded Eleanor of a part of herself she thought long buried. But just as Eleanor began to wrestle with these feelings, her world was shaken by a phone call. Lord Cavendish's voice, usually so composed, carried a tremor she had never heard before. Eleanor was in danger, he said. Real danger. And though she dismissed it at first as another of his overreactions, the gravity in his tone made her pause. The source of the danger was Alexander. What had once seemed like harmless flirtation had twisted into obsession. He had always been ambitious, but now his ambition was darkened by jealousy and a desperate need for control. His affections, once flattering, had turned into threats Eleanor could no longer ignore. It was Lord Cavendish who reached out to James. The request was simple: Eleanor needed protection, and James was the only man he trusted. But James hesitated. The wounds of their last encounter still lingered, and the idea of stepping back into her world filled him with unease. Yet, as he looked at Lily, as he thought of Eleanor's quiet acts of kindness, he knew his decision had already been made. In the quiet moments before the storm, James prepared himself. This would not be a return to duty, but something far more personal. Eleanor was no longer just an assignment, and the stakes were no longer just about safety. The storm was coming, and James knew he had to face it head-on. The city lights faded into the distance as James drove through the endless night. His mind was a battlefield of memories, fears, and determination. He had seen war zones before, had felt the weight of life and death pressing against his chest, but this was different. Eleanor was different. She was no longer just a woman he had been tasked to protect. Somewhere along the line, she had become something more, an echo of the life he thought he couldn't have, a reminder of the humanity he had buried beneath years of duty and sacrifice. Eleanor's kidnapping had been swift and precise, the work of a man who knew her habits, her vulnerabilities. Alexander had always been charming on the surface, but beneath that polished exterior lay an obsession that had finally boiled over. His actions were fueled by jealousy, yes, but also by a deep-seated need to control what he could not possess. Eleanor's rejection had been a wound he couldn't bear, and now, she was caught in the storm of his unraveling mind. For Eleanor, the hours stretched like lifetimes. The opulence she had always surrounded herself with was replaced by cold steel and shadows. Yet, even in the depths of fear, her mind returned to James. She thought of his unwavering gaze, his silent strength, the way he had always seemed to stand between her and the chaos of the world. She had driven him away, and now, she wondered if that had been her greatest mistake. James arrived at the abandoned warehouse in Birmingham with a precision born of experience. Every step he took was calculated, every breath steady. This wasn't just about Eleanor's safety. This was about proving to himself that he could still be the man she needed, the man she deserved, even if he didn't believe it yet. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Alexander's desperation made him dangerous, but James's resolve was unshakable. In the chaos, there was a moment when their eyes met, Eleanor's filled with relief and unspoken gratitude, James's with a determination that bordered on ferocity. When the dust settled, and the world seemed to exhale its first breath in hours, the weight of everything fell upon them both. Eleanor, trembling and vulnerable, looked at James with an openness she had never shown before. And James, for all his stoicism, found himself unable to look away. It was in the quiet after the storm that truths finally began to surface. James spoke of Lily, of the kindness Eleanor had shown her, of the way she had stepped into their lives without expectation of recognition. And Eleanor, her voice trembling with emotion, admitted that she had never expected to feel this way about anyone, let alone him. Their first kiss wasn't the fiery clash of two opposites but a quiet surrender, a moment that felt both inevitable and profound. It was the culmination of every glance, every unspoken word, every moment of tension that had passed between them. In the days that followed, the world seemed to shift around them. Eleanor, who had always been so guarded, began to let James into the corners of her life she had kept hidden. And James, who had spent so long carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, found a partner willing to share the burden. But their newfound connection wasn't just about them. It was about Lily, whose joy at their union was a light in their lives. It was about Lord Cavendish, whose approval came not from a place of obligation but genuine respect for the man who had not only saved his daughter but had also brought out the best in her. When James proposed, it wasn't with grand gestures or extravagant displays. It was simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal, a ring that carried the weight of his past and the promise of their future. And when Eleanor said yes, it wasn't just an acceptance of him but an acceptance of herself, of the person she had become because of him. The wedding was a celebration not just of their love but of the journey that had brought them together. The Cavendish estate, so often a symbol of wealth and power, became a place of warmth and connection. And as they danced beneath the stars, surrounded by family and friends, the world seemed to pause, if only for a moment. In that moment, James whispered words that would stay with Eleanor forever. "You saved me as much as I saved you." Their story wasn't just one of love but of redemption, of finding light in the darkest places, of learning that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in vulnerability. It was a story that reminded them, and everyone around them, that even the most broken among us can find wholeness in the arms of another. And as they left for their honeymoon, the world felt quieter, fuller, and infinitely more beautiful, a reflection of the love they had fought so hard to build.